Some time ago, I was contacted by an Italian couple who were very distraught over an experience with their 10-year-old son. One day, he returned home from school, announcing to his parents that he had chosen to be a girl. At the school he attends, the curriculum, even at the level of 10-year-olds, includes the teaching of the iniquitous gender theory. I have heard similar stories from the United States and Belgium. In the case from Belgium, the parents actually then permitted their young son to wear girls' clothing. The young Italian parents asked me what they should do. I suggested that the matter was not complicated, that they should sit down in a serene way with their son to explain how God made us, male and female, and that we accept our sexual identity as a gift from God, not as our invention. I further suggested that they might want to read to him the story of creation from the book of Genesis. I observed that no 10-year-old would come up with such an idea had it not been suggested to him in school, and that they should insist that he not be subjected to further instruction in gender theory. Subsequently, they did what I suggested, and they said that their son was perfectly at peace and had given up the idea that he was a girl. I tell this story to illustrate how critical education is to the future of our children and our society. I tell it also to underline how critically important it is for parents to follow carefully the education of their children and not to fear to intervene with professional educators who are corrupting their children. Lastly, I tell it to introduce a reflection on how the Catholic education of our children and young people is an irreplaceable instrument of a new evangelization. I speak of Catholic education of children and young people in the sense of a complete education, that is, the development of reason through the competent imparting of knowledge and skills within the context of the faith. In other words, education in the true sense of the word is the acquisition of knowledge and skills in the context of the study of God and of His plan for us and our world, as He has revealed Himself and His plan to us. Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical letter, Divini Ilius Magistri, described a Catholic or Christian education with these words: "The proper and immediate end of Christian education is to cooperate with divine grace in forming the true and perfect Christian. That is, to form Christ Himself in those regenerated by baptism, according to the emphatic expression of the Apostle, 'My little children, of whom I am in labor again until Christ be formed in you.' For the true Christian must live a supernatural life in Christ, Christ who is your life, and display it in all His actions, that the life also of Jesus may be made manifest in our mortal flesh. For precisely this reason, Christian education takes in the whole aggregate of human life, physical and spiritual, intellectual and moral, individual, domestic and social, not with a view of reducing it in any way, but in order to elevate, regulate, and perfect it in accord with the example and teaching of Christ. Hence the true Christian," I continue these with the words of Pope Pius XI, "hence the true Christian, product of Christian education, is the supernatural man who thinks, judges, and acts constantly and consistently in accordance with right reason, illumined by the supernatural light of the example and teaching of Christ. In other words, to use the current term, the true and finished man of character. For it is not every kind of consistency and firmness of conduct based on subjective principles that makes true character, but only constancy in following the eternal principles of justice, as it is admitted even by the pagan poet when he praises as one and the same the man who is just and firm of purpose. And on the other hand, there cannot be full justice except in giving to God what is due to God, as the true Christian does. If we love our children and young people as true sons and daughters of God, we will be tireless in the work of imparting to them just such a complete education. It is only such a complete education which can lead them in the way of eternal salvation to happiness in this life and the fullness of happiness in the life to come. Only such an education will lead them to the transformation of our culture. Children and young people who receive a complete education become effective, joyous, and courageous agents of the transformation of culture in their homes and in the various areas of their endeavor. In order to deepen the reflection on a truly Catholic education for our children and young people, I will first set the context of education today, that is, the situation of the world in our time and the Christian response to it. Second, I will address the family as the first place of education and its relationship with the school. Thirdly, I will address the irreplaceable service of education in the transformation of our culture through the development of a listening heart in students. Finally, I will briefly address education concerning the right relationship of faith and reason. The fundamental service of the family in the transformation of culture, the great challenge which the whole church confronts today, the church in the first cell of her life, the family, confronts in a particular way. It is the challenge which Pope John Paul II described in his apostolic letter, Novo Millennio Ineunte, at the close of the great Jubilee of the year 2000, as the high standard of ordinary Christian living. Pope John Paul II taught us the extraordinary nature of our ordinary life because it is lived in Christ, and therefore produces in us the incomparable beauty of holiness. Seeing in Christian families the fruit of the daily conversion of life by which the family members strive to meet the high standard of ordinary Christian living, the culture will discover the great mystery of ordinary life upon which God daily showers his ceaseless and immeasurable love. Clearly, the mending of the Christian fabric of society, to use the words of Pope St. John Paul II, can only come about by the remaking of the Christian fabric of the ecclesial community, beginning with the individual in his family at home. Pope John Paul II taught us clearly that the way to meet the challenge of the high standard of ordinary Christian living is found in the gospel and in the living tradition. We've just heard about this with our battle stance, that our legs, one is founded in the gospel and the other is founded in the church's teaching in the living tradition. He reminded us that it is the same program of Christian living as it has always been in the church, the program of holiness of life. Regarding Christian marriage and the family and the call to evangelization, in his 1981 post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the family, Familiaris Consortio, he declared that the Christian family, in fact, is the first community called to announce the gospel to the human person during growth and to bring him or her through a progressive education and catechesis to the full human and Christian maturity. Christian education in the family and in the school introduces children and young people in an ever more profound way into the tradition. And if it doesn't, it's not education. into the great gift of our life in Christ and the church, handed down to us faithfully in an unbroken line by the apostles and their successors. Education, if it is to be sound, that is for the good of the individual and of society, must be especially attentive to arm itself against the errors of secularism and relativism, lest it fail to communicate to the succeeding generations the truth, the beauty, and goodness of our life and our world, as they are expressed in the unchanging teaching of the faith, in its highest expression by means of prayer, devotion, and divine worship, and in the holiness of life of those who profess the faith and worship God in spirit and in truth. Noting the multiple and grievous attacks on marriage and the family in our time, Pope John Paul II stressed the importance of witnessing to the truth about marriage and the family, so that the family may evangelize the whole of society. And that's the critical importance of the witness of those parents with their son, having to do with the fundamental question of our personal identity as man or as woman. At a moment in history in which the family is the object of numerous forces that seek to destroy it or in some way to deform it, and aware that the well-being of society and her own good, the good of the church, are intimately tied to the good of the family, the church perceives in a more urgent and compelling way her mission of proclaiming to all people that the plan of God, to proclaim to all people the plan of God for marriage and the family, ensuring their full vitality and human and Christian development, and thus contributing to the renewal of society and of the people of God. Recognizing the irreplaceable evangelizing power of the family in the whole of society, the church is even more impelled to devote herself to safeguarding and fostering the truth of married and family life. In our Christian witness and apostolate, we must give special attention to the sanctity of marriage, to the fidelity, indissolubility, and procreativity of the marital union. A truly Christian home life is necessarily a sign of contradiction in today's society. We must therefore inspire courage in Christian couples to give the witness to the truth about marriage and family, which our culture so sorely needs. We must help Christian homes to be the domestic church, according to the ancient description, the first place in which the Catholic faith is taught, lived, and witnessed. The whole church must help parents to live generously and faithfully their vocation to the married life. We must be especially attentive to families who are in trouble, so that even in their suffering, they may enjoy the graces of unity and peace of the Holy Family of Nazareth. We see, in fact, in an unmistakable way, the evangelizing power of marriage and the family in the primary duty of parents to educate their children, helping them to know their vocation in life and to embrace it with an undivided heart. The fundamental evangelizing power of parents in what pertains to the vocation to the married life is evident. The fundamental locus of the proclamation of the gospel of life is the family, in which the children witness the gospel in the relationship of their parents with one another and in the relationship of the parents with them. Such witness pertains not only to the beginning of human life, in the correct understanding and living of human sexuality, but also to the end of life, in the acceptance of human suffering as the way of unconditional love of others, in accord with the teaching of the Lord, which St. Paul articulated in the first chapter of his letter to the Colossians. The gospel of life is integral to the spiritual worship at the heart of the family. lifting up their hearts to the heart of God, parents and children are purified and sanctified and strengthened to live their relationships with each other in pure and selfless love. St. John Paul II made this clear in his encyclical letter on the Gospel of Life, declaring, as part of the spiritual worship acceptable to God, the Gospel of Life is to be celebrated above all in daily living, which should be filled with self-giving love for others. In this way, our lives will become a genuine and responsible acceptance of the gift of life and a heartfelt song of praise and gratitude to God who has given us this gift. This is already happening in the many different acts of selfless generosity, often humble and hidden, carried out by men and women, children and adults, the young and the old, the healthy and the sick. This is the story of sound family life. You don't need to be a rocket scientist. All you need to do is to open your eyes to the mystery of God's life within us as it's expressed most fundamentally in the call of man and woman to form a lifelong, faithful, and procreative union. In this regard, it is important to make clear the relationship between a new evangelization regarding human life and the practice of the virtues of purity, chastity, and modesty. Respect for human life is related essentially to respect for the integrity of marriage and the family. The attack on the innocent and defenseless life of the unborn has its origin in an erroneous view of human sexuality, which attempts to eliminate by mechanical or chemical means the essentially procreative nature of the conjugal act. The manipulation of the conjugal act, as Pope Paul VI courageously observed, has led to many forms of violence against marriage and family life. Through the spread of the contraceptive mentality, especially among the young, human sexuality is no longer seen as the gift of God which draws a man and a woman together in a bond of lifelong and faithful love, crowned by the gift of new human life, but rather as a tool for personal gratification. One's sexual union is no longer seen to be procreative by its very nature. Human sexuality is abused in ways that are profoundly harmful and indeed destructive of individuals and of society itself. One is only to think of the devastation which is daily wrought in our world by the multi-billion-dollar industry of pornography, or the incredibly aggressive homosexual agenda, which can only result in the profound unhappiness and even despair of those affected by it, and in the destruction of society as it has always done historically. The restoration of respect for the integrity of the conjugal act is essential to the future of Western civilization, of Western culture, the advancement of a culture of life. In the words of Pope Benedict XVI, it is necessary once more to hold up to future generations the beauty of marriage and the family, and the fact that these institutions correspond to the deepest needs and dignity of the person. This is the fundamental truth which should be imparted by all education. In our society, there is a confusion about the meaning of human sexuality, which is reaping a harvest of profound personal unhappiness, often to the point of the breakdown of the family, of the corruption of children and young people, and ultimately of self-destruction. Disordered sexual activity outside of marriage, and the constant and potent false messages about who we are as man and woman, served up by the communications media, are the signs of a desperate need of a new evangelization. We must witness to the distinct gifts of man and woman to be placed at the service of God and his holy people through a chaste life. Christian marriage is the primary locus of that critical witness. Through sound family life, our society will be transformed. Without sound family life, it will never be transformed. The Catechism of the Catholic Church reminds us that so-called moral permissiveness rests on an erroneous conception of human freedom, and that the necessary precondition for the development of true freedom is to let oneself be educated in the moral law. The whole meaning of the word education means to be led forth to the slavery caused by ignorance, to the freedom which comes with knowledge of God and of his plan for us. As is clear from the above considerations, individual freedom and the freedom of society in general depend upon a fundamental education in the truth about human sexuality and the exercise of that truth in a pure and chaste life. The Catechism of the Catholic Church goes on to observe, those in charge of education can responsibly be expected to give young people instruction respectful of the truth, the qualities of the heart, and the moral and spiritual dignity of man. That is found in number 2526. For the Christian, this entails education in holiness of life and in the respect owed to the inviolable dignity of self, body, and soul, and of others as oneself. Such education must first take place in the family and then be sustained in the institutions which work with parents for the Christian education of their children. The family and the school. For the sake of our young people, we must give particular attention to the fundamental expression of our culture, which is education. Good parents and good citizens must be attentive to the curriculum which schools are following and to the life in the schools in order to assure that our children are being formed in the human and Christian virtues and are not being deformed by indoctrination and the confusion and error concerning the most fundamental truths of human life and of the family, which will lead to their slavery to sin and therefore profound unhappiness and to the destruction of culture. Today, for example, we sadly find the need to speak about traditional marriage as if there were another kind of marriage. There is only one kind of marriage, as God has given it to us at the creation and as Christ has redeemed it by his saving passion and death. At the heart of a solid curriculum is both respect for the dignity of the human person and for the tradition of beauty, truth, and goodness in the arts and the sciences. So often today, a notion of tolerance of ways of thinking and acting contrary to the moral law seems to be the interpretative key for many Christians. According to this approach, one can no longer distinguish between the beautiful and the ugly, the true and the false, and the good and the evil. The approach is not securely grounded in the moral tradition, yet it tends to dominate our approach to the extent that we end up claiming to be Christian while tolerating ways of thinking and acting which are diametrically opposed to the moral law revealed to us in nature and in sacred scripture. The approach at times becomes so relativistic and subjective that we do not even observe the fundamental logical principle of non-contradiction. Monsignor Schmitz reminded us about that this morning. That is, that a thing cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. In other words, certain actions cannot at the same time be both true to the moral law and not true to it. In fact, charity alone must be the interpretative key of our thoughts and actions. In the context of charity, tolerance means unconditional love of the person who is involved in evil, but firm abhorrence of the evil into which the person has fallen. All education should be directed to forming the students in the charity by which the mind and heart respond to the beautiful, the true, and the good as God has created us to do. Fundamental to the life of virtue is the understanding of human nature and conscience. At the heart of the deplorable cultural situation in which we find ourselves is the loss of a sense of nature and conscience. Pope Benedict XVI addressed the question of the loss of a sense of nature and conscience with respect to the foundations of law in his address to the Bundestag, the German parliament, during his pastoral visit to Germany in September of 2011. Taking leave from the story of the young King Solomon on his accession to the throne, he recalled to political leaders the teaching of the Holy Scriptures regarding the work of politics. God asked King Solomon what request he wished to make as he began to rule God's holy people. The Holy Father commented, "What will the young ruler ask for at this important moment? Success, wealth, long life, destruction of his enemies?" He chooses none of these things. Instead, he asks for a listening heart so that he may govern God's people and discern between good and evil. The story of King Solomon, as Pope Benedict XVI observed, teaches us what must be the end of political activity and therefore of government. He declared, "Politics must be a striving for justice, and hence it has to establish the fundamental preconditions for peace. To serve right and to fight against the dominion of wrong is and remains the fundamental task of the politician." Pope Benedict XVI then asked how we know the good and right which the political order, and specifically the laws, are to safeguard and promote. While he acknowledged that in many matters the support of the majority can serve as a sufficient criterion, he observed that such a principle is not sufficient for the fundamental issues of law in which the dignity of man and humanity is at stake. Regarding the very foundations of the life of society, positive civil law must respect nature and reason as the true sources of law. In other words, one must have recourse to the natural moral law which God has inscribed upon every human heart. Referring to the text of St. Paul's letter to the Romans, regarding the natural moral law and its primary witness, the conscience, Pope Benedict XVI declared, "Here we see the two fundamental concepts of nature and conscience, where conscience is nothing other than Solomon's listening heart, reason that is open to the language of being." Further illustrating the sources of law in nature and reason by making reference to the popular interest in ecology as a means of respecting nature, he observed, "Yet I would like to underline a point that seems to me to be neglected today as in the past. There is also an ecology of man. Man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. Man is not merely self-creating freedom. Man does not create himself. He is intellect and will, but he is also nature, and his will is rightly ordered if he respects nature, listens to it, and accepts himself for who he is, as one who did not create himself. In this way, and in no other, is true human freedom fulfilled." Isn't that the service that Italian couple gave to their little son? That he came to understand that he was not simply intellect and will, but also nature, and that his happiness comes from respecting the nature which God has given to him. What Pope Benedict XVI observed regarding the foundations of law and the concepts of nature and conscience points to the fundamental work of education. I now reach this point, namely to develop in students a listening heart, which strives to know the law of God and to respect it by development in the life of the virtues. The arts and sciences are most fully taught to students within the context of the divine order which they ponder and express. As Christians, we must help society to recognize a certain order which permits the individual to pursue his own good while at the same time respecting the good of others who form a community with him. The good is defined by the order found in the nature of persons and things, by which the same persons and things are directed to objective ends. In truth, the individual must understand that his own good cannot be served while the good of others and the order of creation are violated. The individual cannot achieve his proper end, and therefore happiness, apart from respect for the proper and ultimate happiness of his neighbor and for the proper end of the things with which he interacts. Life in common is otherwise reduced to the tyranny of whatever group is able to prevail by winning the support of a majority. Without the recognition of the common good, to which the individual good is essentially related and which it serves, society breaks down and is soon beset by the violence and destruction which are the inevitable fruits of unbridled individualism and self-pursuit. The fulfillment to which the common good is directed is not a self-defined condition, but rather the perfection of the individual or group according to man's proper nature and end. The objectivity of the common good as it is discovered by right reason and the natural order determines the good order of a nation. Children and young people must be educated to safeguard the common good, which rests on the reality of the nature and end of the persons and of the things with whom and with which they relate. It is essential that citizens be educated in the virtues which help them to understand the common good and to obey the law which safeguards it. In his encyclical letter Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI takes up the question of the common good, which in his words is sought not for its own sake, but for the people who belong to the social community and who can only really and effectively pursue their good within it. Dedication to the common good, as Pope Benedict XVI makes clear, is an obligation imposed by both justice and charity. He concludes, the more we strive to secure a common good corresponding to the real needs of our neighbors, the more effectively we love them. Essentially connected with the discussion of the natural moral law is the correct understanding of conscience. It is the conscience, the voice of God speaking to souls, which is, in the words of Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, the aboriginal vicar of Christ. As such, the conscience is ever attuned to Christ himself, who instructs and informs it through his vicar, the Roman pontiff, and the bishops in communion with the Roman pontiff. Blessed Cardinal Newman observed that conscience, and I quote, this is from his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk, is a messenger of him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. Today one must be attentive to a false notion of conscience, which would actually use the conscience to justify gravely sinful acts. In his 2010 Christmas address to the Roman Curia, Pope Benedict XVI reflected at some length on the notion of conscience in the writings of Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, whom he had beatified in that year during his pastoral visit to the United Kingdom. He contrasted it with a false notion of conscience, which is pervasive in our time. He declared, in modern thinking, the word conscience signifies that for moral and religious questions, it is the subjective dimension, the individual, that constitutes the final authority for decision. The world is divided into realms of the objective and the subjective. To the objective realm belongs things that can be calculated and verified by experiment. Religion and morals falls outside the scope of these methods and are therefore considered to lie within the subjective realm. Here it is said there are in the final analysis no objective criteria. The ultimate instance that can decide here is therefore the subject alone, and precisely this is what the word conscience expresses. In this realm, only the individual, with his intuitions and experiences, can decide. Newman's understanding of conscience is diametrically opposed to this. For him, conscience means man's capacity for truth. The capacity to recognize precisely in the decision-making areas of his life, religion and morals, a truth, the truth. At the same time, conscience, man's capacity to recognize truth, thereby imposes on him the obligation to set out along the path towards truth, to seek it and submit to it, and to submit to it wherever he finds it. Conscience is both capacity for truth and obedience to the truth, which manifests itself to anyone who seeks it with an opening heart, a listening heart. Conscience, therefore, does not set individuals apart from one another as arbiters of what is right and good, but unites them in the pursuit of the one truth, ultimately our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the only arbiter of the right and good, so that their thoughts, words, and actions put that truth into practice. Later in that same Christmas address, Pope Benedict XVI recalled his encounter with the world of culture in Westminster Hall during his pastoral visit to the United Kingdom, during which he reflected on the proper place of religious belief within the political process. Taking inspiration from the example of St. Thomas More, he addressed directly the ethical foundations of civil discourse. As a service to culture in general, he set forth the Catholic understanding of the matter with these words. The central question at issue then is this: where is the ethical foundation for political choices to be found? The Catholic tradition maintains that the objective norms governing right action are accessible to reason, prescinding from the content of revelation. According to this understanding, the role of religion in the political debate is not so much to supply these norms as if they could not be known by non-believers, still less to propose concrete political solutions which would lie altogether outside the competence of religion, but rather to help purify and shed light upon the application of reason to the discovery of objective moral principles. Pope Benedict XVI noted that the role of religion in public discourse is not always welcomed for various reasons, which can also include distorted forms of religion, such as sectarianism and fundamentalism. He observed, however, that such distortions do not justify the exclusion of religion from public discourse, for reason too can fall prey to distortions as when it is manipulated by ideology or applied in a partial way that fails to take account of the dignity of the human person. What remains necessary and true is the right relationship of faith and reason. He concluded, this is why I would suggest that the world of reason and the world of faith, the world of secular rationality and the world of religious belief need one another and should not be afraid to enter into profound and ongoing dialogue for the good of our civilization. Pope Benedict XVI concluded with an invitation to safeguard and foster the right relationship of faith and reason, which is essential to the pursuit of the common good of society. To conclude, education which takes place in the home and is enriched and supplemented by truly Catholic schools is directed fundamentally to the formation of good citizens and good members of the church. Ultimately, it is directed to the happiness of the individual, which is found in right relationships and has its fulfillment in eternal life. It presupposes the objective nature of things to which the human heart is directed. We have to get rid of this metaphysical boredom. This is a great disease. We have to be in love with the pursuit of the knowledge of being itself and the deepest truth about all of reality. It presupposes the objective nature of things to which the human heart is directed, if it is trained to be a listening heart. It seeks an ever deeper knowledge and love of the true, the good, and the beautiful. It forms the individual to this fundamental pursuit throughout his or her lifetime. Thus, the individual becomes an agent of a new evangelization and of the transformation of our culture. May God, through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, seat of wisdom, inspire and strengthen us in forming listening hearts in our children and young people who are the hope of our future. Thank you very much. God bless you.